John, you're going to present now. And
I think many of the questions apply both of us, so you're free to come in. The Bank of England is the government agency which is in charge of looking after the national currency, money. In 1997, Gordon Brown gave the Bank of England independence. Who thinks that was a good idea? Who thinks it was a bad idea?
Who knows?
In recent years, the Tory government has privatized, started back under Blair actually, privatized parts of the NHS. Who thinks that's a good idea? Who thinks it's a bad idea? Listen, that second question is a lot more difficult than the first question. The second question involves things like how health should be delivered, what people's illnesses are, how we should allocate it. The first question is a trivial question, yet nobody has an opinion on it. Why? Much of the answer to that is economists themselves. I've been an economist, taught my first economics course in 1964, and if your arithmetic's pretty good, you can figure out that that was 54 years ago. And during that 54 years, I have discovered almost consistently that economists speak rubbish, but they don't want you to think they speak rubbish, so they speak in a way that is very hard for you to understand. When I was at the University of Texas, and despite my accent, I'm a British citizen, I'm a member of the Labor Party itself, but I was born in Texas, I had this old codger who taught public utility economics. His name was Robert Montgomery. He was universally known as Professor Bob. Professor Bob had been called before the Texas, what would we now call it, terrorist committee, but it was the Texas Committee on Subversives. And he was asked by a Texas senator and said, Professor Montgomery, are you the member of any subversive organization? And Professor Bob said, yes, Senator, I'm proud to say I'm a member of two. I'm a member of the Democratic Party that says every person has an equal vote, and I'm a member of the Methodist Church that says you don't have to have a priest to read the Bible. And he should have a third law. Professor Bob said, that third law, you don't need an economist to explain the economy to you, because most of it is quite straightforward. And I'm going to give, it can be complicated. There are complicated things. There are complicated things about running the National Health Service. Yeah, yes, you know what your opinion is on that. And I'm going to touch on what I think is probably the most basic misunderstanding. And it's not a misunderstanding because it's so complicated. It's a misunderstanding because it's been drugged into us. You probably think, and I think 99 people out of 100 think, that the purpose of the British government taxing is to fund expenditure. And if you don't have enough taxation, if you don't have enough revenue, you can't spend. That's false. National governments do not, if they're intelligent, if they have a good economic policy, they do not tax for the purpose of funding expenditure. They don't even do it mechanically. We have this image of balanced budget. I was on a BBC 4 program about 2 months ago called, it was about metaphors basically, and there were all the usual ones, black holes, balancing the budget, all of these nonsense metaphors. But the basic point I'm making about taxation is the following. There is this image that the revenue flows in as this bag here, it's the revenue, right? And over here, and you've got a list of all these things you want to spend on. And what you do is revenue flow, you put some of that. And oops, it's empty. What am I going to do now? I mean, isn't that the way people think about expenditure? Yes. It's completely wrong. It's nonsense. Not even mechanically. How does the Ministry of Health fund its expenditure? the Bank of England, to the Ministry of Health, is assigned a account in the Bank of England, which it then draws on in order to make its expenditures. How much can it draw out? The amount which has been passed in the budget. That's how much it can draw out. It has nothing to do with whether or not there's a revenue flowing in. And that's why these discussion of things like, should we have an earmark tax for the National Health Service? Sure, why don't we have an earmark tax for parking meters? It would be absolutely meaningless. So, to sum up, governments, if they understand what's not even economics, if they understand what spending and taxation is about, they do not tax in order to spend. Deficits are not a problem. The deficit, even when it was 10% of GNP in Britain, was not a problem. The public debt is not a burden. I just have to have a digression on that one. Who here has a private pension? Well, I won't make that, but I assume that some people have private pension, maybe because you're a teacher or whatever. What is the asset that is probably the most important in the funds that fund that pension? Public bonds. Britain has a debt. It appears to be 98% of GNP. A third of it is held by the Bank of England itself. A third of it is held by the government itself. It pays interest to the Bank of England, which is then required to turn around and give that interest to the government. So it cancels out. So there's a third of it. Another 50% of it is in pension funds. And it's only less than 30% that is bought and sold and held by foreigners and things like that. So the idea that the deficit is a problem is wrong. The deficit, debt is a problem is wrong. And the debt actually is something that is beneficial to us, and it is beneficial to the private sector. So let me stop on that because I might have said a few things that people have questions about.
So I've heard people make this argument before, and the thing that people always come back with is like, we're going to end up like Greece. That if our debt is too big, then it will cost too much to borrow money, and we won't be able to like service our debts, and so we'll be like Greece.
Yeah, George Osborne said that. I think actually George Osborne was perhaps the only intelligent person in David Cameron's cabinet. He was also the Antichrist. The two are related. He made that argument. He must have known, could he have been so ignorant that he thought it was true? I suppose anything's possible. Okay, why is it absurd? Say Britain had a debt of, as Greece does, of 190% of GNP. By the way, in 1945, Britain had a debt of about 265% of GNP. But so all the people holding public bonds said, "Oh my God, they're never going to be able to pay these things off." So we're going to start selling them in a what's called a secondary market. So you buy the bond from the Bank of England, and you can sell it to somebody else. And so the interest rate starts going up because other people say, no, you paid £100 for that bond. I'm not going to pay you £100 for that. I paid for 90 because I'm never going to pay it back. The Bank of England could stop that instantly, and the way it would stop it instantly is it would issue more bonds, or it would purchase those bonds. And it could do it endlessly because we have our own currency. The problem with Greece was, as being a member of the euro, it could not create money. Actually, that's not quite true. It is prohibited by European rules from creating money. The Bank of England didn't create as much money as it wants. So it never has to worry about defaulting because it can buy back its own bonds, it can sell more bonds, it can always prevent interest rates from rising. And that, in fact, is what the Bank of England does. And that's why there can never be a default and there can never be a high interest rates unless that actually becomes a policy of the government as it was in the early 1990s.
I think that's pretty mind-blowing. Does anybody have any questions for
I have
John?
one question. You mentioned bonds. Do you then, I don't really understand what bearer bonds are.
What kind of bonds?
Bearer bonds?
Well, bonds are given a lot of different names and a lot of different types. And I think the bonds issued by the Federal Reserve System and by the U.S. government, and by the British government, basically can be resold. They can be bought and sold like any other commodity. And I think that's the term in the U.S. that is used for when they say bearer bonds, they're referring to bonds that can be
Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve bonds, yeah.
A super simple one. Could you explain when the Bank of England sets interest rates, why it might increase them, why it might lower them, what impact that has?
Yeah, I mean, I know why they do it, but I actually don't think it makes much difference. It's not hard to understand. It just gets so bloody tedious, you know. All right, most of economics is really about accounting, but let's say the bank, those people that run the Bank of England believe that they can affect the amount of credit in circulation by changing the interest rate. So you lower the interest rate, it's cheaper to borrow, and so therefore more people run along to the bank and so on, and that puts more money in circulation, and people spend it, and that has caused inflationary pressures. It's a Bank of England line of argument. And so the rate of inflation 3%, oh my God, rate of inflation 3%, we got to do something about that. So you raise the interest rate, and you say, well, now people are going to borrow less and so on. But I think actually all of that is not true. I think it's not true because, first of all, in Britain and in the United States, I'm not sure about the continent, but in Britain and the United States, most business investment is not carried out through bank borrowing. Most of it is either by businesses giving each other credit or by the selling of junk bonds. So actually, I think that the movement, I think it's a sham policy. In other words, I think it is going through the motions of having a policy, and ideologically it's become important because of this ideology of balancing the budget. You've got to balance the budget. Well, if you have to balance the budget, how are you going to manage the economy? Oh, we'll let the Bank of England do it. You know, leave it to those experts over at the Bank of England. And from the point of view of the elites, the great thing about leaving the Bank of England is it is unaccountable. Nobody elected the head of the Bank of England. No one will ever elect the head of the Bank of England. There are no elected representatives there. There are no representatives of the public, unlike the Federal Reserve System in the United States. So I think that it is partly ideological.
It's not why we put the Queen's head on. We didn't elect her either.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm a bit ignorant. Like, what's the bond and why is it issued or not issued?
Okay, take a pound note, all right? A pound note is basically a bond with a zero interest rate. Okay. Now, because there's a zero interest rate, it can be bought and sold and very easily and shifted around and so on. The companies issue bonds, junk bonds, or class 3A bonds. I mean, in the old days they did. In the old days, companies would issue bonds instead of borrowing from a bank. So you want to build a factory, instead of going along borrowing from the bank, you would issue bonds. Your company would you would promise to pay a certain interest rate on it. Okay. Why does the government issue bonds? The government issues bonds in part to fund expenditure. There are two ways to fund expenditure. One is through taxation, the other is through issuing bonds. But there are other reasons why governments issue bonds and be held in pension funds, for example. Businesses, the Bank of England bond is about as safe as you can get. If businesses have cash they want to hold idle, they want to hold it in the form of a Bank of England bond. And what is it? It's a piece of paper that guarantees, say, in 10 years, to pay you £100, you pay £100. 10 years from now, you'll get back £100 on it. In the interim, you can buy and sell it. Its price may go up, its price may go down. But you know that at the end of that, that's called a fixed term bond, that you can collect the face value of it. In the interim, you'll be paying, you pay 1% or 3% or whatever it happens to be.
Does that change with inflation or not?
No, Britain has never issued inflation-linked bonds, to my knowledge. Maybe sometime in the remote past, but they don't issue. So that's about it. Yeah.
Is there any particular reason why a country like Greece is prohibited from creating currency, and then Britain is allowed to do so?
Okay. Superficially, it appears that the reason is that Britain has its own currency, so therefore the government has sole authority over well, that's not quite true, excuse me, I have to be careful, I got a real monetary expert over here. That the British government, or one of its institutions, has sole authority for managing the currency, you might say. In the case of Greece, it has a central bank. However, that central bank is not allowed to create credit in euros. Only the European Central Bank is allowed to do that. That is because it was a condition that the German government set on that for the creation of the euro. The leaders of the Central Bank of Germany said that they would support the creation of the euro if and only if sole power were given to the European Central Bank to to determine the expansion and contraction of credit by governments. So it's basically a rule within the European Union. If anybody thinks this has extremely important implications for the argument over Brexit, by the way.
You say, since we have our own currency, the Bank of England could just print money to fund the things we need. If you put that to Philip Hammond, why do you think he would disagree?
First, ideologically, would disagree because he probably doesn't want to spend money anyway. But let's take the serious point. So let's say old Phil and I are having a discussion, and I said, hey, we don't have to worry about the deficit. Deficit's not that big, and it's going down. It is. It's quite small now. And he would say, well, if we keep borrowing, we're going to build up that debt. And if we build up that debt, there will come a day when the financial markets will get nervous about us having so much debt, and they'll think we can't service the debt. And so that will lead us to a position where we'll have to have even more austerity than we do now because we'll have to draw down the debt. I think he would say probably something like that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, what's wrong with that line of argument? Let's go back to what I began with and said, well, not exactly where I began, but the idea that the purpose of taxation is not spending. If you imagine a balloon, okay? And got economy written on it. By the way, I would define the economy as the integrated system of production, distribution, and exchange. So that we've got a balloon here, and we're blowing it up. When it's sort of loose, that's when we have less than full capacity. So there's unemployment, and the factories are working. Factories on the left are working at 65% of capacity, and so as we blow the balloon up, we're getting closer and closer to full capacity. And then if you blow it up too much, it explodes, right? Okay. Well, it doesn't exactly explode, but you begin to get inflationary pressures. Businesses are attempting to hire workers away from each other because there's a shortage of workers, and so they're putting up wages. Prices are going up, and so on. Now, the purpose of taxation, like expenditure by the government, is blowing up that balloon, right? Because what happens when the government expends is it pays people's salaries, it buys medicine for the NHS, it builds roads, it's a whole range of things. Okay. So how are you going to get in what I've come to call the Goldilocks zone, not too big, not too small, just right. So the economy is close to full capacity without entering into inflationary pressures. The way you do that is you use the tax instrument, because what you do when you tax is you take money away from people. So when the government's spending, it's putting funds out there. It's increasing the demand for the things we produce, goods and services. When it taxes, it takes it back. So that's why you should never worry about whether the budget is balanced, because it would only be an accident that you would have the economy close to full capacity and you would have a balanced budget. It would really sort of be an accident. Usually, you'll be running a deficit, you'll be running a surplus, and the purpose of that balance is to try to balance the economy. You aren't trying to balance the budget, you're trying to balance the economy.
Yeah. So as mentioned before that there are lots of different definitions of the economy. Do you have one that you like and can remember now?
Yeah, I would say that the economy is the integrated system of production, distribution, and exchange. And when production, that's turning things out, things and services. The distribution, I'm referring not to the distribution of those goods, but the distribution of income. And the exchange refers to the buying and selling. See, a market system, I also, in my misspent youth, wrote a book called Marx. Marx, the first, I know you didn't sign up for this, but I'll be brief. The first chapter of Capital, the last section of that chapter, let's see, here we are, quoting the Bible, is called a fetishism of commodities. And what Marx meant by that is exactly the question you're raising. He asked the question, why is there an economy? Why do we have this concept of the economy? And the answer to that question is the development of market society. Because if you think of the feudal system, for example, most people did not buy and sell things, very occasionally. The large estates were, for the most part, self-sufficient. And what happened with the market economy is bit by bit, people faced a situation in which they had to purchase the things which previously they had produced themselves. And the reason they had to do that is that they increasingly became wage laborers, and they were paid with money. And they were no longer able to produce their own things, so they had to purchase things. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what we mean by the economy, really. A system. It is a modern concept of a system in which the reproduction of people's lives requires you to go through exchange.
Societal man.
Yeah. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about inflation, like what causes it, what its impact is? A very simple way.
Yeah. First of all, is economics a science? This comes up. I would say there are rigorous and logical aspects of economics, but it is not primarily a science. But I'll give you an example of a rigorous aspect of it. Is when we come to answer the question that you asked, we have to begin somehow to simplify the system, because we can't, because first of all, just the concept of inflation is an abstraction if you think about it for a moment, because when the Bank of England says prices are going up by 3%. Well, actually, some prices are going up and some prices are going down. But on balance, the way we measure it, the price level is going up. Sometimes most of the prices are going up. If you have the inflation index is increasing by 10%, for example, then most things will be going up in price. But the idea of inflation and there's a price level, those are abstractions, and they're almost metaphors. Okay, so what causes inflation? There are theoretical differences, but put it simply in straightforward language. There's inflation, which is a result of excess demand. People are paid their salaries and their wages, they go out and spend the money. Businesses are investing, and you begin to get shortages of things. Businesses want to build a building, there's not enough concrete to do it, it pushes up the price of concrete. People go to the supermarkets and there are temporary shortages, and so prices go up and so on like that. So that's called excess demand inflation. And sometimes it's called demand pull inflation. But anyway, it's resulted too much money chasing too few goods. The other usual explanation is what's called cost push inflation, and that's for some reason that down at the bottom, prices are of key things begin to rise, and that can produce inflation when the economy maybe has substantial unemployment. And the most famous example of that is the oil price increases in the 1970s. Most of you are too young to remember that, but there were these two very large short moments of petroleum prices went up, 1972, 73, and 1979. And these, because petroleum is so important as an input, not only to run machines, but it's made into plastics and all sorts of things, that you began to get increases in prices due to that. Completely straightforward. But the modern ideology of inflation is that inflation is caused by an excess of money, and and that leads to an excess of expenditure. And part of that ideology is zero inflation should really be our target. That we tolerate 2%, 3%, but it should really be at zero. But again, forgive me for going on about it, but this is nonsense. I mean,
did I answer your question?
Yeah. Right, yeah. Because there was a study done in the United States several years ago that showed that about 1.5% inflation is not inflation at all, because it is a measure of quality increase. Well, yeah, I guess you would say quality increase. You may not want the quality. So, for example, your automobile, it now costs more than an automobile cost 10 years ago. How much is that inflation? How much is that inflation? How much is having all these, useless electronic gadgets in it, and a computer determined steering wheel and all this sort of stuff. But at any rate, I think you can see that somehow you have to adjust for that, and that the inflation target the Bank of England uses does not adjust for that.
Yeah. What measures do you think should be taken with the economy if you want to start saving the environment?
If one's what?
Start saving the environment.
I mean, to protect the environment? Well, I've written a little bit about this. I would say public transport, conversion of what's left of the conversion of use of the way you heat houses. I don't know if you've ever been into the place where MPs have their offices, Portcullis House. It is a building which has no heating system. Well, it does have a heating system. It burns no fuel whatsoever. The heating system is completely the result of the circulation of air within it. And so I would say, a friend of mine has written a document called a Green New Deal, woman named Anne Pettifor. Some of you may have heard of her, a very prominent British economist, far more prominent than I am. And she goes through the steps. Public transport, the way heating is done. I also think, this is probably more controversial, I think that we need to restrict the amount of things that we import. I mean, a very high proportion of, or a substantial proportion of global pollution is a result of transporting, shipping, and air transport. How are you going to deal with that? You're going to have to deal with that by reducing the amount of trade, I think.
Yeah.
First of all, may I say how grateful I certainly we are for what your contribution is. I've learned a lot myself. Now, I work around permaculture. I'm on the board of the Permaculture Association of Britain. But my interest is in community money and mutual credit. Because everything you're talking about this evening is around the national economy. It's possible to use a mutual credit system where we back the money ourselves and we can create our own money systems, our own currency system. That can take place. But we haven't spoken about this at all this evening. It just so happens, my name's Les Moore, I live about a quarter of a mile away. I work with Michael Linton, who developed the first let system in the 80s. My lets were thousands in the 90s and 2000s. And I started the Hackney currency system. So I've done all the community money. And now that the opportunity is just developing around, we've all heard of the Bitcoin, it's possible now to have community-based, community measurement systems now. And I'd be delighted to share this with you because it's great that you're running this course around money here. But just I'd like everyone to know that there's more than one money system, and we have to
let's chat afterwards to see if we can incorporate that.
Well, no,
somehow into the
there's a
rest
whole
of the
session on that. It's the last of these 7 sessions.
Thank you very much.
So please join us.
By the way, if I can put in a plug, if you're interested in it, I go through all of these things in a book of mine called The Economics for 1%. It's selling for the quite low price of about £10 now. But if anybody's interested, I can also send you a PDF of it if you want to read it in that form, because I didn't write it to get rich. I wrote it in hopes that more people would read it than have.
Can I also just jump in, and if our work interests you at all, we're across social media. If you want to find us online, we're ecnmy.org, so it's economy without the O's, same on all the social media platforms. We're also looking for volunteers, for writers. There's loads of different ways you can get involved through the school's work, through our marginalised communities work. But maybe you just want to find out a little bit more. We've got effectively like economic encyclopedia on the website, so yeah, do have a look. Thanks.
I really recommend that, by the way. We don't use it for my job, so yeah. Does anybody have a final question for Antonio or John?
It might be a big one. What happened last week with the stock market? I didn't get that at all. It might be too big for the time we've got left, in which case I'll do some research.
A famous American economist who once said that stock market is a good predictor of recessions. Has predicted 7 out of the last 3. Stock markets are rational systems. They represent what Marx called fictitious capital. They are representations of capital. And with the deregulation of finance over the last 30 years, what the financial sector does increasingly is it speculates on currencies, it speculates on whatever it can speculate on. And I think to a certain extent, it is a random event. We are lucky that it didn't feed into the real economy, because that's what happened in 2008, because when a similar time event led to the collapse of a lot of asset prices that fed through the banks. I'm not sure what particular bit of irrationality generated it, but it shows how we're living on the edge and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, go for it.
Maybe just slightly related to just this topic. So as I was listening to that bit of news, and they were saying like, oh, $1 trillion or whatever was burned. But what does that mean? Like, did we really lose that much money, or was it money just transferred from one pocket to another? What does that mean that when they say that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, when I came to write a section in this book about the crash of 2008, 2009, I said to myself, okay, well, trillions of dollars were wiped off U.S. Balance sheets of companies. Where did it go? Had it never been there to begin with? And the simple answer to that question is that it's a redistribution within the financial sector. So some financial institutions have taken losses, and that stuff that was wiped out was wiped out from them, and a few have had compensating gains. So it's basically, fortunately in that case, in the latest case, it is a redistribution within the financial sector. So that one ledger, they say plus, 757 billion, and over here they're saying minus 630. And we are lucky that it didn't translate into the real economy.
I'm curious to know whether you've come across stories or films that really help tell these stories, like for people who wouldn't necessarily come to those like this. Because I used to work as a journalist, and one reason I left was I felt a lot of the stories I was telling were mostly reaching people who mostly agreed with me. My last job was at Wall Street Journal in China, and now I'm currently looking at doing a solo comedy show as a Chinese and very rich woman talking about money and her brilliant ideas about money, just using capitalism in the East while we move to the West. So I'm just curious, but it's really difficult to find stories I feel are successfully telling stories about the economy or money, or just asking those questions about what is a good life. So I'd be interested to know if you feel that as another way of getting people to talk about these things.
Yeah, for sure. Well, firstly, I completely agree, and I think it's really key to engage different mediums because as I said, we're running free economics courses, but it's very hard to break out of the bubble that you would expect to come to those sort of things. I think there have been a few really successful examples. Biggest one that springs to mind was I, Daniel Blake, obviously the Ken Loach film, in terms of really strong economic story and narrative, but in a super accessible format. I'll have a think about some others. I mean, even, I know it's not exactly the same thing, but even, for example, the Grind for Corbyn movement engaged so many young people who would have never been involved or interested in Corbyn politics at all through, something that they were interested in. And so that's another example, I guess. I'll have a little think, but I think it's really...
There's also this, what was the name of it? The film narrated by Matt Damon about...
No, it was a few years before that. I know the one you're talking about. It's more documentary though.
Yeah, it's a documentary, yeah.
Yeah.
Where he interviews all these...
That was quite good, but I feel like I don't know who would watch that who wasn't already... I mean, it's informative for people who maybe already have a bit of an interest. Yeah. I wonder just how you can almost take people by surprise, but also, because we're all part of this system that you say, we're all enacting it in some way. It doesn't exist independently. Yeah. So we do need to be talking about more, and I'm just curious to know, if you come across stories that were inspiring.
This company called Tablespeak, and they've done a show called Inflation, which is where they tell the story about the financial crisis on a bouncy castle. And we're going to try and get to bring it back here. That's like, you know, but, yeah, so that sort of thing. You know.
Great. So we're going to wrap up this bit. The bar is open.
It is.
So I would encourage everyone to stick around. Can you guys stick around for a little bit? Great. So next week we have a session on why can't you afford your rent, with Toby Lloyd from Shelter, who's really good and has written a book that is getting rave reviews about the state of the housing market.
And there's also going to be someone from the London Renters Union going to be here to talk as well. And there's also someone who's doing their PhD on young renters in Hackney who's going to say a little bit about it. It's going to be quite local and relevant. So check on the website as well. There's 7 events: money and mental health, how feminism is shaping the economy, etc. Lots of really interesting talks. Please stick around now. Please feel free to talk to Antonia and John. They're going to stick around for a bit. I'm also going to come and try and find as many of you as possible because I want to know how it was tonight and what else we can do. We're going to do a reading list and also a kind of arts and cultural list, or film or drama or novels list, where people can access the subject in other ways. We did a quick straw poll in terms of how easy or accessible the level was tonight, so we can learn for the future. If it was kind of like good level, the level's about right to understand, can you do this? If it was a bit too difficult, tricky, can you do this? And if it was just too, you know, accessible, too easy, can we do a quick, so I can just sort of see where the level sits for you? It's kind of all right. We're in the right level. Okay, great. And let's have a big thank you.
Yeah.